Welcome to In the Word, a study of the International Bible School lesson. Join Dr. Lee Magnus, Professor Emeritus of Bible, and Dr. Bill Gwaltney, Professor Emeritus of Bible, both from Milligan College, as they bring you their thoughts and knowledge of the study of the Sunday School lesson for the day. Now, here is Dr. Magnus.
Good morning. We're glad that you're choosing to use part of your Lord's Day to join us in our lesson in the Word. We hope that you get to be in worship this morning. I'm looking forward to that, and whether you can or can't, we're grateful that you've joined us in the Word at least. And we continue our study in the New Testament this time on the theme of covenant. We've had a whole quarter of lessons on covenant, and now we're coming to the end of that, but we've moved up into the book of Hebrews, where we're going to see that the new covenant we talked about last week, promised by the prophet Jeremiah, has been fulfilled, and we have a mediator of that covenant, and that's the theme of our lesson today. Dr. Roberts and I will be talking about the passage from Hebrews. Welcome.
Thank you. Good to be back.
Glad you're here. We miss Dr. Gwaltney,
yes,
don't we? He's not able to be with us this week. We're looking forward to his return. He's our host and anchor teacher, so we miss him, but grateful that you and I get to talk through our passage today. This passage from Hebrews is going to focus on the new covenant that Jeremiah prophesied, and we'll focus on Jesus as the mediator of that new covenant. That's the title of our lesson today. But this passage emphasizes the contrast between the old covenant and the new, which we talked a little bit about last week. But the old covenant is the Sinai covenant, right, isn't it? Yeah.
And this reference in Hebrews chapter 12 goes back to the experience of being before Mount Sinai, which was an awesome experience. The people had come out of Egypt, they were in the wilderness, they came to Mount Sinai, Moses told them to prepare, and it took a couple of days of preparation. Mm-hmm. And then when the time came, they were scared to death.
They were. And
even Moses was, as the text indicates.
They were told to gather around the mountain, but then they were told not to touch the mountain.
Right.
And so there was quite a fearsome situation in which they had to be present during the giving of the law, but couldn't violate the holiness of God by even touching that mountain. Yeah. As we're going to learn from our passage today, Moses himself was terrified,
yes,
by the whole experience.
But the whole thing that's talked about here in Hebrews is showing the contrast between that experience and what we have as Christians.
Yeah.
And it's a great passage.
Yeah, it is. You know, there's a passage in Galatians where Paul does a similar thing, where he compares the old and the new covenant that way. We probably should say again something we said last week. There's never any hint that the old covenant was bad,
no,
is there, in any of this? But that God was bringing about a new covenant, which was even better than the good one.
And that's what Hebrews stresses, that all of the Old Testament was good, the relationship with God through the law was good, but what we've got now is so much superior.
Yeah.
That's what's...
And that is the theme of the letter we call Hebrews, precisely because the author had noticed that some Christians were slipping back more into a Judaic kind of Old Covenant kind of thinking, and were abandoning, or at least letting go a little bit, of their focus on Jesus and their loyalty to Jesus.
I think there's always a tendency to want someone to tell us what to do, what not to do, give me the black and white of it, I can live by that. And the people then were prone to go back to the law because you could just keep the laws, that's enough. And Hebrews is saying, no, it isn't enough. We've never done it right. We've never kept them well enough. That's what Paul said in his letters. But that tendency of going back means that they're turning away from Jesus.
Right.
And the book of Hebrews is saying, don't do that.
Yeah.
Look at what you're leaving.
I've tried to cut those early Christians some slack by reminding myself that the only Bible they had, the only written Bible they had, was the Old Testament. And so when they read the Scriptures, you know, when the New Testament refers to Scriptures, they're really talking about the Old Testament. So when they read the Scriptures, they were reading the Old Testament. They were immersed in the Old Testament.
Yeah.
The New Testament was being written bit by bit, letter by letter, gospel by gospel. But at the time this letter of Hebrews was written, that's what they had. And I wonder if that didn't cause some of their tendency to put too much of a focus on the Old Testament.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Well, one good illustration of the point you're making about the purpose for the writing of Hebrews is found in Hebrews chapter 4, verse 14. Let me read a couple of verses here. Since then we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God. Let us hold fast to our confession. And then verse 16, let us therefore approach the throne of grace with boldness so that we may receive mercy and find grace in time of need. That idea of holding fast to our confession of faith in Jesus Christ is a key theme throughout this letter.
All through this book.
Yeah.
Through the whole book.
And we're going to see it in the passage that we're studying today as well. We're going to look for it as we go.
Chapter 11, right before this, is the famous faith chapter. All the Hall of Fame, if you will, of all the people of faith who've lived. But the end of the chapter indicates, but they didn't move on into the fullness of God's glory because they were waiting for us, as chapter 12 opens.
Right. And chapter 12 opens with the important and familiar passage about let us run with perseverance the race that is set before us, keeping our eye on Jesus.
Right. Pioneer and perfecter of our faith.
Pioneer and perfecter of our faith. And that phrase, pioneer, the term pioneer means leader, the person who's out front, the forerunner, the bushwhacker, the person who's leading it. And perfecter means the finisher, the person who finished
the
it.
anchor man in the relay team.
There you go, yeah. So it's as if Jesus is the first runner and the last runner at the same time. So that's the way chapter 12 starts, making that transition that you just said so well between the great people of God that we read about in the Old Testament, but the importance of now shifting our focus toward Jesus, who is the object of our faith. Yeah. Well, Hebrews 12 is where our printed text is, so let me start reading in verse 14. Make every effort to live in peace with everyone and to be holy. Without holiness, no one will see the Lord. See to it that no one falls short of the grace of God, and that no bitter root grows up to cause trouble and defile many. Skipping to verse 18. You have not come to a mountain that can be touched and that is burning with fire, to darkness, gloom, and storm, to a trumpet blast, or to such a voice speaking words that those who hear it beg that no further word be spoken to them, because they could not bear what was commanded. Quote, if even an animal touches the mountain, it must be stoned to death. The sight was so terrifying that Moses said, I am trembling with fear. But you have come to Mount Zion, to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem. You have come to thousands upon thousands of angels in joyful assembly, to the church of the firstborn, whose names are written in heaven. You have come to God, the judge of all, to the spirits of the righteous made perfect, to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood that speaks a better word than the blood of Abel. See to it that you do not refuse him who speaks. If they did not escape when they refused him who warned them on earth, how much less will we if we turn away from him who warns us from heaven? At that time his voice shook the earth, but now he has promised, once more I will shake not only the earth but also the heavens. The words once more indicate the removing of what can be shaken, that is, created things, so that what cannot be shaken may remain. Therefore, since we are receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken, let us be thankful, and so worship God acceptably with reverence and awe, for our God is a consuming fire.
Amen.
That is a great passage, isn't it?
Powerful,
Yeah,
yes.
yeah. Now
it starts off with that effort, make every effort to live in peace with everyone.
Yeah. The focus of this passage is truly going to be about our relationship with God and the mediator of God's covenant, Jesus Christ.
Right.
But it starts off with an emphasis on our relationship with one another.
You can't divorce the two.
Yeah.
Our relationship with people, part of our relationship with God.
Right. And you know, that was true in the Old Covenant as well. We don't always think of it, but like the Ten Commandments themselves are just as much concerned about our relationship and treatment of others than of God, right?
Yeah. So many times the prophets in the Old Testament were preaching about morality and conduct with other people and talking about it as if it's the relationship with God, because it is. You cannot separate how you act toward people from the way you believe about God.
Yeah. The passage, our printed text, does start off with an emphasis on our relationship with other people, living at peace. And of course, peace is not just the absence of war, but it speaks of a wholeness of relationship with everyone. That's pretty striking, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah. As Jesus himself taught, our love is not just for those who are like us and do like us. It even extends to enemies,
right?
According to the Sermon on the Mount.
And he talks about the bitter root that grows up to cause trouble and defile many, that a bad relationship with other people, bad attitude toward other people can really destroy a relationship with God.
Yeah. The couple of verses that are left out of our printed text tell the story of Esau.
Right.
And the story of Esau is a story of sibling rivalry and hatred, isn't it?
And making bad choices.
Yeah, that's true. He was making bad choices even before the conflict
Right. Yeah.
with his brother. Holiness is also mentioned prominently in verse 14, isn't it? That we should live in peace with one another and holiness. The concept of holiness speaks of being set apart for the purposes of God. And so it mainly appears to relate to our relationship with God. But holiness also has its impact on the way we relate to one another, doesn't it? Yeah. Well, so we begin with that emphasis on relationship with other, but then he quickly moves on now to the comparison or contrast between these two covenants. And so let's play that out. As we were introducing the lesson, you reminded us of how terrifying the event at Mount Sinai was. And our author here really picks up on that, doesn't he?
Oh, yes, in detail.
Yeah.
Yes.
And reminds us of some of the aspects of that terror. He reminds us that the mountain couldn't be touched, even by their animals.
Right.
And this idea of fire and darkness and gloom and storm, well, that's quite a list, isn't it?
It is. Sounds like earthquake, it sounds like volcano, just so much involved. But the aspect that we have to note is that whole experience of the Mount Sinai covenant experience was life-shaping for all the Old Testament from that point on. And it was such a tremendous experience that everything of their history kept pointing back to the Exodus and to that covenant experience at Mount Sinai. But Hebrews is saying there's something better.
Yeah.
You've not come to the mountain that was so awesome. You've come to something else.
Yeah. In verse 19, there's a mention of the trumpet blast, which called them to the mountain, called them out. Even that, now looking back, was a terrifying thing, because it called them out to face the presence of God. And then this voice is interesting because it's a voice they didn't want to hear. No, I don't want to hear this anymore. It's the voice of God giving them instruction, but it terrifies them so they just couldn't bear it. And even Moses,
I'm trembling with fear.
he admits, even though he's the leader of the people and is called by God to come up and with a face-to-face meeting, admits, I'm trembling with fear. Yeah. Well, when we get to verse 22, we get the contrast, don't we?
Contrast.
And it is such a beautiful description of the new covenant that Jeremiah prophesied, that Jesus inaugurated, and remains the mediator of. So let's look at some of the characteristics of this new covenant.
It's not the Mount Sinai, which traditional expectation as to the location of Mount Sinai is a very awesome sight in itself. It's such a desolate area and so stark in contrast.
Yeah.
But this is Mount Zion.
Yeah.
It's the city, and it's the to the Old Testament prophets, it's the highest mountain in the world.
I know. Mount Zion is high ground in the city of Jerusalem, right, on kind of a neck of land that sits there. And it was important because it's the place where the tabernacle was set up when it was first brought to Jerusalem by David. And then later, it's the site where Solomon built the temple. So the term Zion refers to a hill in Jerusalem, but it has real importance even under the Old Covenant as the site of true worship for God. And so it stands in contrast to this massive, awesome, but somewhat fearsome mountain, Sinai. Now that we know that Mount Zion is in Jerusalem, we're not too surprised when we read the next phrase, which is to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem.
The heavenly Jerusalem.
Yeah.
This is,
So
again,
this is a
greater.
city. Yeah. It's not just an earthly city, but a heavenly one. And that's language that we're going to see again in the book of Revelation, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In Revelation chapter 21, 22.
The holy city coming down from God.
Yeah, we get the same, we get that idea of holiness. But that's a lovely phrase, to the city of the living God. Now, these are all descriptions of the new covenant.
Right.
Yeah, so the new covenant is like a new city in which the living God dwells, and we get to dwell as well. What about the reference to angels here at the end of verse 22?
Thousands upon thousands.
Yeah.
But Hebrews begins by talking about how superior Jesus is to angels, because people apparently were being drawn to some messages that were claimed to be by angels and saying, if an angel spoke it, it's got to be the greatest. And Hebrews is saying, angels are important, but Jesus is far superior to any angel.
Right.
Here are thousands upon thousands of angels.
Yeah.
That's part of what we're coming to.
Yeah, that's a good point. Paul, in one of his letters, warns them against the worship of angels. And evidently, some people were so enamored of these wonderful messengers of God that they worshiped them, their attitudes approximated worship. And here we see, no, the angels are not objects of worship, they are fellow worshipers.
Right.
And they have gathered by the thousands in joyful assembly in this new city to worship God.
Yeah.
And that's an image that we also get in the book of Revelation,
Yes.
of the angels joining the church in worship.
And church is the next thing that's said.
Okay, good.
Church of the firstborn.
Isn't that a great
is.
phrase? Yes.
That's great.
So firstborn obviously refers to Jesus.
Yeah.
And that's a phrase that's used throughout the New Testament, not frequently, but a few times, the firstborn.
But here, a church is not spoken of as a monolithic institution, but it's the church of the firstborn whose names are written in heaven.
Okay.
It's the people of God
The people.
who are the church.
So the church is not just a political unit like a city. The term city here refers to the citizens,
Right.
and the church refers to the people.
Yeah.
I think I remember something about the church is the people, right? Didn't we used to do that?
Here's the steeple.
Yeah, see all the people.
Yeah.
There's a great song too. I forget now how it goes. The church is not a building. No, let's see. The church is not a resting place. The church is the people, is the way it ends anyway.
Yeah.
So that's a good point. Whose names so it's not the church that's written in heaven, it's the individual members of it.
Yeah.
Paul loves this phrase firstborn. He uses it prominently in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 about the resurrection.
Yes.
And where Jesus is referred to not only as the firstborn of all creation, that's in Colossians, firstborn of all creation, but then later he's referred to as the firstborn from the dead.
Right.
So we get creation, resurrection, recreation. So that word firstborn, I don't think I ever saw a church named that. Have you?
I don't think so
I've
either.
seen
I
the
haven't
Church
thought
of
about it.
Christ,
Yeah.
the Church of Jesus Christ, but I never saw one, the Church of the Firstborn.
But he goes on, you've come to God, the judge of all.
Yeah,
And that's
yeah,
what this new covenant is about.
yeah. And that's kind of the climax here. That's one of the themes of Hebrews, that because of Jesus, we have access to God.
Right.
It's the language of the throne room, where we think of the book of Esther, where you couldn't approach the king on your own, right? You had to be bidden. And but in the book of Hebrews it says, no, because of the work of Jesus Christ,
We have boldness.
we have boldness to enter.
Yes.
Yeah, we have access. And so that phrase, you have come to God, really speaks of that. At the end of verse 23, who are these spirits of the righteous made perfect? How do you think we should think of that?
I don't know, it may be the people in chapter 11, those
Okay.
faithful who trusted in God through the centuries.
It may be, and it may look back to faithful Christians who already, by the time that the book of Hebrews is being written, can be looked at and admired and emulated because of their faithfulness in persecution or whatever, who maintain their righteousness. And the book of Revelation, which is kind of prefigured in so much of this, also refers to the persecuted saints who are there at the throne and whose voices are crying out.
And New Testament survey, we used to talk about the literature of persecution, Hebrews, 1 Peter, Revelation,
Okay.
where they're talking to people who've suffered for their faith or are facing suffering.
Yeah. And then, in a way, by climax here, verse 24, to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant. What's a mediator? How would you...
The go-between, the one who brings something about where you've got separate parties that need to be brought together.
Yeah. Reconciler, mediator. Middleman is literally what it means, middleman. Usually we don't like the term middleman, don't we?
Yeah.
We like to try to eliminate the middleman,
out the
right?
middleman,
To get a better deal. But in this case,
we need the mediator.
we definitely need the
Yes.
middleman in this one. And then to the sprinkled blood that speaks a better word than the blood of Abel. The sprinkled blood should remind us, I think, of the Day of Atonement, when the high priest, who is Jesus, by the way, sprinkled the blood of the goat on the mercy seat of God to bring about forgiveness for the people.
But this blood is not the blood of the goat. This is his own blood.
This is his own blood.
This is It speaks a better word than the blood of Abel that cried out from the ground. And to the Hebrew, to the people who were receiving this book, this writing of Hebrews, if they were inclined to leave Jesus and go back to Judaism, and go back to the law, what Hebrews is saying here is that his blood is crying out from the ground.
Yeah.
And greater than Abel.
The blood of Jesus.
You can't leave him.
Yeah. And that's the point of verse 25. See to it that you do not refuse him who speaks. We can't go back now.
Right.
We can't step back away from Jesus. And he gives us a quote from Haggai in verse 26 about the importance of hanging on. The warning of God is about not only shaking the earth like Sinai, happened at Sinai, but shaking the heavens as well as the earth.
Yeah.
The power of God is just as real as ever, but the power of God is now demonstrated in the saving death of Jesus,
Right.
which reconciles us.
Yeah.
Well, verse 28 is kind of the climax of our passage. Therefore is a word that means, okay, we're going to take everything we've talked about, and here's the conclusion. Since we are receiving a kingdom, we talked in the last week's lesson about God restoring the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. But here we learn that there is a whole new kingdom,
Right.
that the new covenant is establishing. Peter refers to it in 1 Peter. We are now a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a new people of God's possession. And how should we be living? In fear?
Let's be thankful.
Yeah, it's beautiful, isn't it?
Yes.
Whereas the old covenant engendered fear and terror, the new covenant, which was still powerful, God is still powerful, should engender thankfulness and inspire worship.
Right.
Yeah.
Worship in reverence and awe.
Yeah. It reminds us, we still talk sometimes about the worship wars, which style of worship is most appropriate, and we argue about the style of music and things like that. I think this is a good reminder that it's possible to use any style of worship in a self-centered way that does not focus reverently on God. Any kind, even traditional forms,
Right.
can focus on ourselves rather than on God.
Right.
So the challenge to me, at least, is that whatever style of worship we participate in, that we make sure we're thinking, how can I please God?
Right.
And how can I express reverence and awe for God? Because even though it's a new covenant, awe is still appropriate.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And notice how it describes God at the end.
Yeah, consuming fire.
Yeah.
And the emphasis that's being made here is that the worship of God should never be trivialized.
Yeah.
It's not something you just take for granted and do it without thought.
Yeah.
You come to God with reverence and awe because of the wonder of the grace of God.
Right. It's interesting, this passage kind of began talking about a burning mountain, Mount Sinai, and it ends by reminding us that God is still a consuming fire. And so even though we celebrate His grace, we worship Him with awe and reverence. Well, what a great way to end our discussion today, talking about the new covenant and Jesus' role as the mediator of a new covenant. Thanks for joining us this week, and I hope you can be with us next week. Have a good week in the Lord in the meantime.
This has been In the Word, a study of the International Bible School lesson with Dr. Lee Magnus, Professor Emeritus of Bible from Milligan College, and Dr. Bill Gwaltney, Professor Emeritus of Bible of Milligan College. Join us again next week for another lesson from the International Bible School lesson text. This has been a production of the First Christian Church Television Ministries.